everyone. Today we're talking about chapters 23 through 28 of Deathly Hallows. And the first thing I want to do is revisit our discussion of allegory. We've talked about how the series can be read as an allegory for 20th century world history, particularly World War II. Like any allegory, it's not one-to-one. And one of the places that we see this is with the figure of Hitler and Nazism. Initially, it seems like Voldemort is meant to be Hitler, but in this book we find out more about Grindelwald, and there's some evidence to suggest that he might be the Hitler of the allegory. Most pointedly, Grindelwald's murderous campaign through Europe ended in 1945 when Dumbledore defeated him and imprisoned him in his own fortress, Nurmengard. This tracks with the end of World War II, which was followed by the Nazi war crime trials at Nuremberg. We also find out that Grindelwald appropriated the Deathly Hallows symbol, turning it into a symbol of his fascist wizard supremacist movement, which is similar to the history of the swastika. So, some Harry Potter scholars have asked, if Grindelwald represents Hitler and the Nazis, what does Voldemort represent? Again, recognizing that the allegory may not be one-to-one. We don't need perfect corollaries, and they could even both represent aspects of Hitler. But the text also seems to suggest that what the Death Eaters have done to the Ministry may allude to 1980s Britain. This is the era of Margaret Thatcher, whose government was conservative and nationalist, with power centralized in the Prime Minister. This was also a period of rising white supremacy and xenophobia toward immigrants. It's interesting that the pamphlets we saw being assembled at the Ministry, apparently designed by Umbridge, who is herself a Thatcherist figure in many ways, including the way that she uses conservative femininity to political advantage. But these pamphlets feature a red rose being strangled by Muggle weeds. The red rose is a symbol of England, suggesting British nationalist undertones to this anti-Muggle propaganda. And I think that makes much more sense as a nudge to the reader that we should be thinking of Thatcherism than as a straightforward symbol of British identity, given that the magical world's relationship to Muggle-operated nation-states is a bit confusing. The other thing to keep in mind is that while Rowling began the series in the late 1990s, the last 3 books were written in the years just after 9/11. Islamophobia, government surveillance, and suppressions of civil liberty were all ramping up in both the US and Europe. For example, we can certainly read the Snatchers, who round up Muggleborns and blood traders, as being the Gestapo, or the Schutzstaffel, from World War II, but I think it's equally valid to read them as TSA, detaining Muslim people in airports, or ICE, arresting people speaking Spanish in public, or law enforcement at every level harassing, arresting, and killing Black people who are just going about their days. All of which is to say that sometimes a historical lens can be too easy and too comfortable. None of us were around for World War II, so even if we have qualities in common with the people involved, or we have relatives who were involved, we can still feel some distance from that metaphor. But these government-employed perpetrators of violence toward people assumed guilty and disposable because of their Muggle-born identity absolutely have counterparts in our world, in our country, today. And I think that Rowling, writing in the years immediately following 9/11, was speaking to that too. Alright, the second topic I want to talk about is Lupin. I've always been troubled by Lupin in this book. To start with, he's in a relationship that doesn't seem to make sense. And I don't mean that Lupin can't be with Tonks because he was in love with Sirius. Regardless of what Rowling says, I think there's textual evidence for that relationship, but it doesn't preclude Lupin then loving Tonks. The man can be bisexual. And as an aside, I love the reading of Tonks, who is a metamorphic, as genderqueer. But what I mean about this relationship not making sense is that starting with the scene in the hospital at the end of Half-Blood Prince, I've been looking out for any hint of affection or love when Lupin's together with Tonks. And he doesn't show any. With the possible exception of reading his apparent anger when Tonks finally gets to the burrow as an expression of worry for her. But that's all we get. And it's not coupled with any scenes of affection or warmth, or even any indication that he's feeling happy in general. And I know he's still dealing with grief and trauma, which affect people in different ways. But it's striking how he is written as so unhappy when Tonks is over the moon about this relationship. And he seems to confess to this unhappiness when he comes to Grimmauld Place and tries to abandon his marriage and his baby on the way. Lupin's the responsible, dependable adult in this series. He's one of like 3. So it's pretty alarming when he's not. Then in these chapters, the baby's born, and it seems that Lupin's almost immediately left to go tell Harry and ask him to be godfather and stay for drinks. Which I understand that telecommunications are complicated in the wizarding world, especially when people aren't hiding, but maybe it's more important to be with Tonks and the baby right now? So I was thinking about all of this, and 3 things occurred to me. The first is that everyone's always accused Sirius of thinking of Harry as James, but maybe Lupin is doing that too. Harry's of age now and interacting with Lupin as closer to an equal. He calls him Remus in this book. And he may even look more like James did when Lupin last saw James. Lupin's effectively the last of the Marauders, and he once called that the happiest time of his life. So, with fatherhood impending and Sirius dead, maybe he's not looking for adventure so much as the comfort of something familiar. The second thought I had relates to Lupin's lycanthropy. Rowling's post-series statement was that it's a metaphor for HIV and other blood-borne illnesses. But a lot of people read it as a chronic illness, and the text certainly supports that reading. And while I've always thought of Lupin's condition as static, a lot of chronic illnesses are degenerative. They get worse over time, which is often devastating and terrifying to the person with the illness, as well as their family. So I've been wondering whether Lupin's year with the other werewolves didn't just cement his internalized self-hatred, but may have also given him more information about what lycanthropy looks like if you live into your 40s and 50s. We learn in The Half-Blood Prince that Fenrir Greyback has started attacking, with at least some level of werewolf symptom transmission, outside of the full moon. And this is depicted as a symptom of his evilness, that he chooses to do this. But I wonder if this might also be an indication that the symptoms of lycanthropy become harder to control as you age, that you end up having more and more bad days and fewer good days. Or simply that the physical toll of monthly transformation catches up with your body over time, making you weaker and weaker during your daily life and less able to exert any sort of restraint as the full moon approaches. If this is the glimpse of his future that Lupin got during his year with Greyback's group, he may feel that it would be better to go off on a dangerous, probably fatal mission with Harry. Or, at a minimum, he may not be so different from Harry, who thinks of Ginny getting married and realizes that he can't imagine his own life past Voldemort, that there's no future there for him to imagine. The other thought I had about Lupin is related to trust. I often think of Lupin's storyline as being defined by his lycanthropy and by his relationship with Sirius, canonically and non-canonically. But trust and betrayal are also major themes for Lupin's character. When Lupin and Sirius are reunited in the Shrieking Shack in Prisoner of Azkaban, we learn that the reason the Potters changed their secret keeper from Sirius to Peter and didn't tell Lupin was because they suspected Lupin of being the mole. Peter then betrayed the Potters' trust, leading to their deaths, Sirius's imprisonment, and Harry's childhood at the Dursleys. At the beginning of this book, when the Seven Potters plan goes awry, Lupin is furious that someone has betrayed them. So when Harry says, "We've got to trust each other, I trust all of you," Lupin pityingly compares him to James, who would have regarded it as the height of dishonor to mistrust his friends. It's clear that he's thinking back to Peter's betrayal, but this is also a much more cynical Lupin than at Christmas 7 months before, when Harry tried to talk to him about Snape in Half-Blood Prince. In that conversation, Lupin said, "It comes down to whether or not you trust Dumbledore's judgment. I do, therefore I trust Severus." In the intervening months, Snape has killed Dumbledore, causing everyone to conclude that Dumbledore's judgment was wrong and Snape was not to be trusted. Side note, and this is a spoiler, so turn off the sound for about 20 seconds if you're a first-time reader. I wonder if Dumbledore, in planning for Snape to kill him so as to keep Draco's soul intact and Snape's cover in place, took into account the fact that this could potentially do serious damage to the Order's ability to trust each other. Clearly that wasn't the biggest consideration, but trust is essential to how the Order operates, and Snape's apparent betrayal was a significant blow. Okay, and side note. Back to the main point, which is that since Christmas, when Lupin assured Harry that he trusted Dumbledore, and therefore Snape has killed Dumbledore. And remember that Lupin, in particular, took Dumbledore's death very hard, breaking down into weeping in hospital wing when he heard. With the exception of Hagrid, it's unusual for our central male characters to cry in this series, and they usually try to hide it, because sexism. So it's notable that Lupin responded this way. He was losing one of the most important adults in his life, who trusted in Lupin's goodness as a child and as a teacher when society didn't. And Lupin was also experiencing another betrayal, another person he loved betrayed by one of the people that they trusted. So Lupin's not at his most ready to trust at this point in his life and in the series, which may low-key be one of the reasons that his marriage isn't off to a great start. And yet, when Kingsley arrives at the Burrow, following the Seven Potters' rescue, he establishes Lupin's identity by asking Lupin about the last words that Dumbledore said to them together. And we find out that it was, "Harry is the best hope we have, trust him." Despite the evidence that Dumbledore's judgment in trusting Snape was wrong, Lupin does trust Dumbledore's judgment about Harry. When he comes to Grimmauld Place and asks to go with them, Lupin says he doesn't even need to know the mission. He can just tag along and be useful. Though Harry rejects his offer, let's not miss the fact that Lupin is ready to blindly trust Harry and, by extension, Dumbledore. Maybe Lupin is desperate for a new figure to trust. Maybe protecting and helping Harry will make all the other deaths and sacrifices worth it. Whatever the reason, Lupin is ready to trust Harry 100% at a time when his trust seems to be at an all-time low. Finally, we see maybe the ultimate evidence of that trust in these chapters when Lupin asks Harry to be his newborn baby's godfather, which we know is a pretty serious relationship in the magical world, effectively trusting Harry to be a parent to Teddy if Lupin and Tonks were to die. Before I wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing related to Lupin and Harry. In the chapters you read for Thursday, Lupin is on Potter Watch, and he's asked to give advice to Harry in case he's out there listening. And he says, "I tell him to follow his instincts, which are good and nearly always right." They haven't seen each other since the argument in Grimmauld Place, and Ron's comment immediately afterward about Lupin living with Tonks again implies that we're meant to read Lupin's comment as an admission that Harry was right, that Lupin belonged with his family and not on the Horcrux mission. But I'm also interested in the comment at face value, and I wonder if you think it's true. Does Harry have good instincts? Are they nearly always right? I've been thinking about this throughout this book and the last one, because one thing I see as a character flaw in Harry is that he often jumps to conclusions. He's done this throughout the series, making wild leaps. In the first couple of these books, the leaps are sometimes right, even when they're implausible, or right enough, such that they get Harry to the place he needs to be for the climax, even if he's way off on the details. These first books have a younger audience, so some of the plotting is a bit simpler and requires these leaps in order to move the story along. As the series progresses, the audience ages and the writing and plotting become more complex, so it makes less sense to push the narrative along using Harry's mostly unfounded suspicions, or at least to do so uncritically. So at the end of The Order of the Phoenix, it isn't totally surprising that Harry jumping to conclusions is a big part of what gets Sirius killed. And my expectation of the narrative was that Harry would learn from this and there would be fewer of these impulsive logical leaps. Instead, the text seems to have doubled down on Harry jumping to conclusions, and he seems to be right more often than he should, given that the evidence for his conclusion is often really lacking. For example, in Half-Blood Prince, Harry's adamant that Draco is plotting something right from the start when he sees Draco go into Borgin and Burke's. He's also dismissive of Hermione's suggestion, with some evidence, that the Half-Blood Prince could be female. Harry can just tell that it's a bloke. In neither case is there much to go on, but Harry's right. We see this again in this book. Just in the matter of about 3 chapters, Harry makes the following logical leaps. His invisibility cloak is one of the Deathly Hallows. Dumbledore found the Resurrection Stone. Dumbledore hid the Resurrection Stone inside the snitch. Dumbledore is after the Elder Wand. Dumbledore's wand is the Elder Wand. And there's a Horcrux in the Lestrange Vault at Gringotts. That's a lot of guesswork based on not a lot of facts. I can buy the bit about the Horcrux at Gringotts. Bellatrix's behavior supports that deduction, but the rest of it seems well summed up by this sentence that precedes Harry's realization about the snitch. Quote, "Then the newly tapped spring of fabulous discoveries threw him another gift." End quote. To be honest, I don't know why I'm so bothered by the fact that Harry jumps to conclusions and is so often right. I guess it's just kind of unsatisfying for the narrative to consistently reward implausible theories backed by little to no evidence. Again, I understand the need to move things along, even in a narrative for an older audience. It's like one of those case of the week detective shows where they have 8 different equally good leads that they could follow, and yet the one that they choose generally pans out because they've only got 45 minutes and it would be boring to watch too many dead ends. And to be fair, there are plenty of dead ends and traps and missteps in this book, though they're usually the ones that Hermione proposes after much careful thought. So maybe that's part of it too. Hermione is observant, good at reading people, and diligent about evidence. Harry is none of those things, and yet he's the one whose logical leaps are right. I guess maybe he gets a boost from his connection into Voldemort's mind. I also wonder if maybe he's a better observer than the narrative perspective gives him credit for. The way that you can know something without being able to describe all the tiny bits of information that your mind observed and put together in order to reach that conclusion. But that might be a stretch. In general, we expect books to give us enough to understand how our narrators figure something out without resorting to the, quote, newly tapped spring of fabulous discoveries to gift us with unsupported revelations. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and maybe you can all help me figure out why Harry's instincts are good and nearly always right.